I hate gear videos, so I'm keeping this one short and sweet. Now, I must admit, I wasn't particularly asked about this camera. I am more than happy with my Fuji X-T4. However, I've had the chance to play around with it for a few days, and many of you have been asking my thoughts and opinions, so it only made sense to put together this very quick initial impressions video. As always with these videos, there are a few disclaimers to make sure that we're all on the same page. This camera was not sent to me by Fuji. I was not paid by anyone to say anything about it. I simply borrowed it from a camera shop. I am not a Fuji fanboy and I don't look at these cameras through rose tinted glasses, so if I think something is shit, I'll just say it's shit. Probably why camera companies don't send me their gear for review. Speaking of reviews, this is not one. Anyone who can give you a full in-depth camera review after using it for a couple of weeks is on crack. This is a first impressions video, having used this camera for a few days. Now, if you're new here, I am a full-time photographer, YouTuber, idiot on the internet, and I've been using the Fuji X-T3 and X-T4 for the last 4 or 5 years for all of my travel photography, street photography, and running this YouTube channel. Now, here's a very quick sample of the type of work that I do, just to show you I don't just take photos of leaves in my garden, and also to allow you to make an informed decision about whether to listen to me or to someone else. And finally, I am not going to sit here and read you the spec sheet. I'm sure you can do that yourself. If not, there are plenty of spec sheet readers here on YouTube that you can listen to. Right, that's all the terms and conditions out of the way, so let's crack on. Ergonomics are very important. You can love or hate a camera just by how it feels in your hand. Now, of course, this is very subjective. For example, if you have very big hands, you will love the grip on the XH2. However, if your hands are like mine and they resemble that of a 12-year-old girl, you'll probably find the XH2 grip to be a little bit too deep and too big, even uncomfortable in some scenarios. Personally, I much prefer the X-T4. However, the XH2 does feel a little bit better with the bigger, heavier lenses like the 50-140. Now, this camera is quite chunky. Matter of fact, it's bigger than some full frame systems, and it's noticeably bigger and thicker than the X-T4, to the point where when I put it into my 3-litre sling that I use for my daily carry, I do notice a substantial reduction in how much space I have in the sling. Finally, the button layout is good if you have bigger hands, but like I've said, because my hands are a bit smaller, there are actually a few buttons that I struggle to reach, and I really have to kind of stretch to reach those buttons, especially the ones at the front of the camera. The big question, however, is how does this camera feel? Honestly, I am not a fan. To me, this feels like any other DSLR or mirrorless from any other camera brand. From the grip to the shutter button to the general user experience, this camera to me feels a little bit bland. It does not feel like a Fuji. Another way to put it, it feels a bit like a Sony to use. It's a fantastic tool, but it doesn't make me want to pick it up and go out and take photos. And that's the thing, it's a fantastic tool. I'll get into that in a minute, but that's all it feels like to me, a tool. A bit like me. Okay, let's address the elephant in the room, which is the new top mode dial as opposed to the traditional Fujifilm separated dials. On the one hand, I much prefer the X-T4, where you can see all of your settings simply by glancing down at the top of the camera. On the other hand, the 7 custom modes that you can save are way superior for the power user and for the most demanding shooting conditions. If you're a photographer, that I would say that the traditional top dials that you'd get on the X-T4 or the X-T3 are superior. In one glance, you can see your shutter speed, your ISO, your exposure compensation, even when the camera is switched off. With this XH2, you just simply can't do that without turning the camera on, and it's just one more thing to get in your way. However, if you're a videographer or a 50-50 hybrid shooter, especially one that does a lot of client work, then the system on the XH2, in my opinion, is superior. Being able to have different memory banks with specific settings and changing them in a matter of seconds is very useful. For example, you can have one video setting that's at 30 frames per second, you quickly flick it to C6, and now you're doing 60 frames per second. You then quickly flick it to C7, and maybe you're shooting in F-Log or in another particular setting. And overall, this makes switching very easy without having to go through the menu. As for the rest of the buttons, this again beats out the X-T4 because there's just simply more buttons to use and more buttons to customize. Personally, I love the dedicated ISO and white balance buttons at the top of the camera, as well as the dedicated record button. They make my life so much easier, especially for video. Now, despite the extra buttons and despite how customizable they are, there is still one issue that I think really needs addressing. I've seen it addressed on other camera brands, and I'm surprised it's not on the Fuji, especially on this one at this price point. And that is that when you save a button to do a certain thing, so for example, a button does your white balance, that would carry over between photo and video, which means if you've customized this camera for video and then you switched into photo, then some buttons would be useless because certain features are video only features, and vice versa. On other cameras that I've personally used, the buttons change depending on the mode. So when you're in video mode, the buttons are set up for video, and when you're in photo mode, the buttons are set up for photo. Hopefully this can be fixed with a software update. I can't see why not, but as it stands, yeah, for a professional tool at this price point, it's a bit disappointing. Okay, let's talk about photography. So overall, it's fantastic. I would say it's easily on par with my Fuji X-T4. Obviously, it excels it in a few particular areas. The main one where I would say it's about the same as the X-T4 is on image quality. Now, I am not a pixel peeper. I don't look at my photos at 400%. I have a life. So just looking at them side by side in general, it seems fine. Now, in terms of autofocus, this is where I've seen the biggest improvement. The camera feels much quicker, it snaps on much quicker, it's more accurate, and on average, I would say a few more shots were in focus, or at least, let's say, what I wanted to be in focus was in focus, compared to my X-T4. The face tracking has seen a huge improvement over the X-T4. The X-T4 wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great either. This is definitely great. It's a noticeable difference simply just by looking at the back of the screen and seeing how it tracks people. This is definitely a big improvement. Obviously, the IBIS has been improved as well. This is more of a video thing, but for photography, honestly, I've not had many issues with the X-T4 IBIS, so this will be even better for those of you who want to take slow shutter photos handheld. So from a technical standpoint, the XH2s is a fantastic photo camera, but so is the Fuji X-T4 and even the X-T3. Do you really need this particular camera? Well, if you do anything that requires high burst rate, that requires the best autofocus and subject tracking, so wildlife, sports, things like that, then sure, you will definitely benefit from this system. However, if you're anything like me and you shoot travel, street, maybe a bit of portraiture, maybe a bit of landscape, honestly, the X-T4 and the X-T3 will do the same job just as well. This is where the XH2s comes into its own and begins to justify its price point. Hands down, it's by far the best footage that I've seen come out of a Fuji camera. The extra dynamic range is immediately noticeable, and honestly, compared to the X-T4, the footage out of this camera just feels so much higher quality. It feels a bit smoother, a bit more cinematic, and generally like it's come from a bigger, more expensive camera. Not only that, but the autofocus is a huge improvement. Honestly, many times when I use my X-T4, I actually leave it in manual focus because the autofocus can hunt, whereas with this, I don't think I've used manual focus even once. Everything I've just shot handheld with autofocus in continuous and with a square in the middle just to point it and let the camera adjust the focus accordingly. The IBIS is also leaps ahead, and for the first time, again, I think it's actually getting to the point where it's really usable. And honestly, if you're really careful and you walk very slowly, you make sure you don't put too much shake in the camera, you let the IBIS do the rest, and when you get home, just run it for a stabilizer in the final cut, you can get gimbal-like walking shots. Finally, there are other many welcome additions to videographers such as photometry, 6K, RAW recording, and a ton of other bits and bobs which overall make this into a fantastic video camera. So who is this camera for and should you buy it? Well, in the UK, this camera retails for £2.5 grand, which firmly pushes it into the professional market. And that's exactly who this camera for. It's designed for professionals who will need the top spec video features and the fastest speeds possible. So for example, if you already own a few Fuji lenses and you're planning to take your video production to a new level, then getting this will definitely make sense from a financial perspective as well as from a longevity perspective. Also, if you're a wildlife photographer or sports photographer or an aspiring one, and again, you already have some Fuji lenses lying around, this is a fantastic system to get, and again, it will last you for a very long time, especially with firmware updates that will come out to make this camera even better. However, keep one thing in mind, it's not just the cost of the camera. As the specs increase, so does the cost of everything else around the camera. So you now need a CF Express card in order to use the best video features. That's very expensive. If you want to shoot in RAW, you now need an external recorder, and to use an external recorder, you now need a cage. So before you know it, you've now spent a lot of money on all this extra stuff. If you shoot RAW, you need a more powerful computer, which is more expensive. You need bigger storage, which is more expensive. So by all means, get this camera for the specs. Just keep in mind, it's not only the 2.5 grand for this camera, it's all the other costs that you need to factor in if you want to use this camera at its highest level. Now, if you still want to shoot video without spending all of the extra and without getting kind of the last 5-10% of performance, just get Fuji X-T4. I've been using it for 2.5 years. It will be just as relevant for another 2.5 years. It's a fantastic camera, and from what I've heard, some of the autofocus firmware updates will be coming to the X-T4 in the future. If you only want to shoot photos, I would say the X-T4 or even the X-T3 will be fantastic for that. And finally, we're now onto the most common question that I've been asked online, is whether I would buy this particular camera. So right now the answer is no, because I am waiting to see what the X-T5 looks like. Now, if I want to take my YouTube or video more seriously, I want to increase the production quality, I want to work on bigger projects or even get paid for video work, this will be a no-brainer for me. I'm already heavily invested into the system, and getting this is going to make the most sense. So right now I'm not doing that, and I don't need 6K RAW for YouTube, but it's definitely an option. The reason I'm waiting for the X-T5 because I think the autofocus and the IBIS will come over to that camera. Also, that should have the bigger resolution sensor, which for a photographer first person, that is more important. So for now, I'm holding off. However, if I take video more seriously in the future, unlikely, but if I do, then this will make the most sense. Okay, that is all that I can say about this camera. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video, hopefully you got something out of it. If you do have any questions about it, just drop it down below. Please keep in mind, I am not tech support, I can't answer every single question. If I know the answer quickly, I will let you know. I've only been using the camera for a few days, I'll probably have it for another 2 or 3, and then after that, I won't use it until I buy one, if I need one. Probably won't, but who knows. Right, I am waffling. So, thank you again for watching, and I shall see you in the next video. Bye.